Hi everyone, it's Kathy. Thank you for joining me today. Today I'll be sharing how to create a super easy flip card. And I wanted to start out and show you how the card actually opens and closes so you have an idea of where we're going to be going with this. So to create the card, I'll be using the Say Cheese stamp set and the coordinating dies, the Giraffe paper pack, and the nested hexagon die set. To start out, you'll need a piece of cardstock that measures 8.5 by 5.5, and with the 8.5 side up at the top of your scoreboard, you're going to score at 2 1/8 and then at 4 1/4. And I tend to go over those score lines a couple of times just to make sure I get a nice deep score. I folded the card along those score lines, but I didn't burnish them quite yet. I just needed to know where they were so that I could adhere a piece of patterned paper on the leftmost side of the card. The patterned paper is cut to 2 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And when adhering that piece down, you want to make sure that you only put adhesive on the top, the bottom, and the left side, because on the right side, we're actually going to cut that piece out with the hexagon die. Next, I put the die in place and I used some temporary tape to hold it in place so that I could run it through my die machine. And I used the score line at the 2 1/8 inch spot to center my die. Now, to do this partial die cutting, I had to run it through my Big Shot. I did try this with my Gemini and I honestly didn't have much luck. So I pulled out the trusty Big Shot and I put my card base with the patterned paper closest to the rollers on the bottom cutting plate. Next, I took the top cutting plate and I lined up the edge of the top cutting plate with the score line that's at 2 1/8 inch, which is basically just past that patterned cardstock that I had adhered down. Then I attempted to roll it through, but my bottom plate caught and it swiveled a little bit, so I had to straighten that out, and then I was able to run it through to get that partial die cut. After I ran that through my die cut machine, I pulled that out and I was able to peel off the piece of the patterned paper that was not adhered down. And again, that's why you want to make sure that you only apply adhesive to the top and the bottom and the left-hand side of that first piece of patterned paper. The next step is to fold along those two score lines, and the 2 1/8 inch score line is a mountain fold, and the 4 1/4 inch score line is a valley fold. When you fold it up for the first time, you do kind of have to push that partial hexagon die cut out and flatten it out so that when the card is closed, it looks like it is a full hexagon. I had run another piece of patterned paper through my Gemini Junior with the largest Wonky stitched rectangle die and adhered that on the inside of the card. I did have a little bit of adhesive on that one corner of the hexagon, so I used my anti-static powder bag and pounced it on there. That helps remove some of the sticky. And then after it sat there for a little while, I used an adhesive remover to rub off the rest of the adhesive. Anyway, now that I know that the card is going to open and close easily, I grabbed my bone folder and then I burnished those score lines really well so that they would be nice and crisp. So the basic pieces for the card are all finished up, and the next thing I did was I stamped out my images and colored them with my Copic markers. I stamped the images with Memento Tuxedo black ink onto a piece of Cougar super smooth cardstock, which that is my personal favorite cardstock to use with Copic markers. I find that it blends really easily. And you'll see as I color the cheese that I didn't really let the markers do what they do, and I kept trying to fix it before letting that ink really dry. So my Swiss cheese eventually kind of looks more like smoked Gouda cheese, but that's okay. I'm still happy with how it turned out. Anyway, to start out with the coloring, I started with V_0, as in violet quadruple 0, and added that around the very edges and where some of the shadows would be in the holes of the Swiss cheese. The reason that I put a violet down first is because it helps to saturate the yellows. And the next color I come in with is Y13. And as I'm adding in the Y13, and I did go directly over the violet quadruple 0 and then extend it out just a little bit, I kept thinking that that yellow is going to be way too bright. but I just kept going with it. And then the next color that I came in with was YR31. And I blended that out. I started to flick towards the center. I kind of wanted to have a nice center highlight on the cheese. So I started to flick that out, and that helped mellow out the Y13 even more. So I was okay with the edges. They weren't too lemony in color. The next color that I had come in with was YR30. And as I was filling it in, I'm thinking this color is going to be way too light. And this is where I should have had a little bit of patience and let the ink dry before trying to add in another color. But I was not being patient, so I grabbed Y32 and went over the areas where I had colored in with the YR30. And because I did that, the holes in my Swiss cheese were too light, so then I had to come in and darken those up with the YR31. At this point, I still wasn't really very happy with how I just didn't have enough contrast around the edges of the edges of the cheese and the holes in the cheese. So I decided to grab Y26 and I started to add that in. And again, I wasn't patient and I should have stopped and started working on the little rat to allow that ink to dry, but I didn't. So here we are with the Y26 and the edges are getting darker, and I'm not too sure that I love this color, but I think it's kind of okay. And because I couldn't leave well enough alone, then I come in with the YR30 and start blending it out, and all that really did was completely blend out the Y26. So I ended up losing the darker areas around the edge anyway. So then I thought, well, maybe I'll just do another coat of the Y32 and see if that helps. And now it's really starting to look like Gouda cheese instead of Swiss cheese. And to make matters worse, I brought in YR24, and now it really looks like Gouda cheese. So I added in the YR24, I blended it out, and then I stopped working on the cheese because the ink was still wet, it was still trying to blend, and I wasn't giving it that opportunity. So after I was done with the YR24, I moved on to color in the little rat. And, well, I don't know, he might be a mouse, but to me he looks like a rat. And I think all these little guys in that stamp set, they kind of remind me of the characters from the movie Ratatouille, which is one of my very favorite movies. So when this set was released, I knew that it had to come home and live with me. Anyway, for the little rats, I started with W6, and I added the W6 in the areas where the shadows would be the darkest, particularly on the ear that's furthest away and along the bottom line of his belly, or the bottom side of his belly, and around his leg, because his leg would be casting a shadow onto his belly. And then I did a little bit of shading underneath his chin and then at the bottom of his little tush and the back of his leg. And then I did go up on the other side of his tail on his little tush just a tiny little bit. Then I came in with W4 to blend out some of the W6. So the thing with the gray markers, whether they're the warm grays or the cool grays, and I'm assuming the neutral grays because I don't really have very many of those, they blend very, very easily together. So I jumped from a W4 down to a W2. And I knew that what would happen is that the W2 would end up bleaching out my W6 and my W4, which is okay because I did want to have the shadows be a little bit softer. They were looking a little bit too harsh. For the very tip of his nose and his paws and his tail, I came in with E21 and E51, just to give it more of a flesh tone more than a pink tone. And then I did add just a tiny little bit of pink on the inside of his ears with the R20. I did come back in with the W4 just to reinforce some of those shadows. After I was done coloring these images, I did run them through my Gemini Junior with the coordinating dies, and off camera I was playing around with the layout a little bit, and I decided that since the one mouse or a rat was sitting on top of the cheese and looking up, I needed to have a rat that was above him looking down. The rat in the stamp set is asleep. His eyes are closed. So at the end, after I'm done with all of the coloring and I put the whole card together, I'm going to show you how to wake him up by opening up his eyes. Anyway, I colored the other two rats the same way. I started with the W6 and I added that in where the shadows would be the darkest. For the little guy who's asleep, there's a little bit of a divot drawn in on his back, so I kind of extended that by doing kind of a real fine flick line with the W6 on his back. And then for the little guy who is looking up and clasping his little hands, I concentrated the W6 along the bottom side of his face and then underneath his paws, and then where his I guess they would be his knees, where his knees are bent. I added dark shadow there. Then I came in with the W4 and blended out the W6, and I left quite a bit of white space on the rats so that I could have that nice highlight. And I also, again, knew that the W2 would lighten up those darker colors quite a bit. Now for the guy with his eyes closed, so that his head didn't just kind of meld into his back, when I came in with the W4 and did the top of his head, I left a tiny little white line between the marker and the stamped line, so that when I came in with the W2, it would still have a little bit of a shadow, but again, his head just it wouldn't appear that his head was just part of his body. For these two rats, instead of doing the bottom of their faces with the E markers, I just colored them in completely with W2. Except for the very tips of their noses, I did leave that white so that I could color that in with the R20. And again, I used the R20 for the insides of their ears. To finish up the inside of the card, I did add another piece of the striped cardstock, and I adhered that down the center between the two score lines. And I made sure not to get it too close to the score line where the hexagon flips over, just to make sure that it didn't impede the opening and closing of the card. I die cut two smaller hexagons, both from white cardstock, and I put a little bit of temporary adhesive on that one and centered it on the turquoise hexagon. And then when I went to put the permanent adhesive on, it moved. The temporary adhesive didn't stick, so I kind of had to fiddle with that and get it back into place. Then I closed the back of the card and rubbed really well, so the white hexagon then transferred to the inside of the card. And that is where I can stamp my sentiment, and it'll be covered up by the larger turquoise hexagon. Then I just used my regular tape runner to adhere the other white hexagon to the front of the card, and this is where I'll be adding in the cheese and my little rats. So I used my tape runner to adhere the cheese, and then I used liquid glue to adhere the rat on top of the cheese. And I also used liquid glue to adhere the rat looking down. And I fiddled with the placement of the third rat, and I thought he was gonna go on the front of the card, but it turned out that he got lost on the bottom there, so I just decided to use him on the inside of the card instead. So anyway, after I had everything put together on the front of the card, I did put it back into my MISTI so I could stamp my sentiments. And when I'm doing two lines of sentiments like this, I do like to stamp one line at a time, just so I can get the stamps closer together so there's not too much space between the two lines. I did use VersaFine Onyx black ink to stamp the sentiments, and then I used liquid glue to adhere that third rat on the inside of the card. And then to wake up the sleeping rat, I used my black glaze pen and just did tiny little dots on his eyes so they looked like they were actually open up, and it kind of added that cute little beady eye look that a rat has. And I also added the beady eyes to the rat who is sitting on top of the cheese. And that's it. That finishes up my card for today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, I'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.